Hello, my friends. I'm Rick, and this is your seat at the table. And we are still looking at a bit of our little dive into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd Edition. This would be circa late 80s, early 90s for a lot of us. This is the complete book of Gnomes and Halflings. The early points before AD&D came out, before Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which a lot of people just flat out call Dungeons and Dragons nowadays. I mean, they've dropped the advanced part for probably good reasons, I guess. The main thing is that back in the day, the halflings and elves were actually a class. So you would play them as a character class, not unlike playing a wizard or a cleric or a fighter. You would choose to be, I'm going to be a halfling, and it was from there they grew, and it's like the gnomes. Gnomes are kind of like this, I don't know, not so loved stepchild of the fantasy races, because so many people pass them over as a playable race, and because in part for a lot of players, illusions are a big staple for gnomes in general, and a lot of their magical powers and things like this are related around illusions. And illusions can be both silly and frustrating depending on how you look at it, or both. And a lot of players don't like them. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like psionics. Psionics, the powers of the mind, is also one of those things that's just slightly off center, or really in left field, the mainstream understanding of how the game mechanics to work, how spells and like magic plays out in a fantasy role playing setting, things like this. So when we toss in these very strange elements, or these very little used elements, so whether it's psionics or we're talking gnomes. So the gnomes themselves, they're really rich. They're a rich race of people with lots of things to offer, lots of fun opportunities. I have had the privilege of actually playing in a campaign that somebody else ran, where it was everybody were gnomes, and so we all had our variations thereof. It's like the halflings. Halflings, most people's understanding of the halfling is from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, from Bilbo Baggins and Frodo Baggins and Samwise and the rest of the gang. That is our general consensus and our majority's people's understanding of how halflings are and operate, which is really selling them short, even from the Middle Earth perspective. If you go and you really do a deep dive into halfling lore and halfling life and how things operate, they're very fascinating people. Excuse me, I've got myself a fresh out of the freezer pop, and I'm trying to keep it from overflowing onto the table. So, I don't know what it is about, when I got the confirmation of diabetes, I had to cut out the Pepsi. So I switched to Pepsi Zero. And Pepsi Zero is still a variation of a damn Diet Pop, because it's not, whatever they got going on in there, it's still different. And it tastes artificial some way, and the colder it is, the better for me personally. The minute it starts getting close to room temperature, I'm done with it, because I'll waste a half a can that way, because I just can't stand the funky aftertaste. Anyway, so when 2nd edition come out, we started. Well, 1st edition actually introduces the the races as races and not as character classes, and it really expands when we get into 2nd edition. And one of the things that this book does is bring to both races a large range of playable character classes for them specifically, and some that are kind of whimsical in some ways, or seem silly. But if you ever actually play, you want a challenge, and I challenge this to experienced players that are getting bored. I said, you know what, when you get bored and you're thinking, oh, we've done everything, what else can we do? Step out of your normal comfort zone. This is when I sit there and I say, look, you've got hundreds of possible subclasses for these various classes. Go through them and pick one of the most unlikeliest ones you would never play on a normal day. and sit down and make an effort at it and see what comes out, because it's just it just the opportunity and just that kind of experience is well worth doing, and it's a good way to start to appreciate things, certain elements of any game system that you grew up playing that you tend to poo-poo or to shrug off or whatever. So when we look at gnomes, we got our various, you know, regional types: the forest gnome, the tinker gnomes. Yeah, there's the other things. The tinker gnomes and the kinder halflings. So the tinker gnomes, I don't know where that. I know it's tied into Dragonlance. The idea being is that these gnomes are more industrially minded, or experimentally industrially minded anyway, and not necessarily are good at it, and they're happy about it. Even when stuff literally blows up in their faces, they're still happy about it. And I think they take the silliness part way too far in some attempt to make these particular gnomes stand out. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but you need to be a certain category of people to really get well into them, and to appreciate the tinker gnomes for their fullest. The forest gnomes traditionally are the most commonly thought of gnomes, and just like the most likely the deep gnomes, or Schneverman or whatever, also the second most commonly thought of. So anyway, we got things like craftsmanship, emotion, taboos, humor, animal friends, warfare, magic, wandering, all kinds of information you may never wanted to know about gnomes. The structure of the kits, so we got the fighter kits, or the breach gnome, the Goblinsticker, the mouse burglar, the tumbler. Now, another thing that comes out of this kind of stuff over time is one of those where somebody goes, I want my character to be able to do this. I want to be an acrobat. I'm going to be one of these guys that's going to do I'm going to use these flashy maneuvers and rolls and things like this in my combat, because I think it looks cool. But I think it's going to give my character some advantages, or make them distinct, or whatever the reasons, and that's fine. But having a large repertoire of information available at your fingertips, not to mention having made use of these things numerous times throughout the decades, it gives you this ability to go, I know exactly how you can play that off. And so, for example, that would be acrobat. There are a sub class for acrobats exactly. And here's another version called the tumbler. So when you can fine tune the guys when they want to do all their, basically you want to do tumbling as opposed to acrobatics, because there's some significant differences. I didn't know any of that stuff until my sister, when we were kids, started going to what was it, gymnastics. I think is what it is. So the tumbler, and so you can pull these things up and use these as a template or an idea book for you to help build upon your players' desires and wishes, or perhaps your own. Perhaps you want to come up with something different or unique. How about a dwarven tumbler? How interesting would that be, right? Or a halfling high wire act. And that would be something else, right? All right, so the image maker, the banisher, the buffoon, a thief, illusionist thief, so it's a multi-class. The stalker, a fighter thief, priest kits, rock tenders, tree tenders, blah blah blah. Then we get into a typical gnomish village, how they would be laid out, etc., etc. And then we get into halflings, and I don't think of all the classes, all the character races out there, there are probably more. The next to elves, I would have to say there are probably more material out there about halflings than there are any other general race out there. Elves would be really second. It'd be a hard toss-up between halfling, elves, and dwarves, but I think halflings, elves, and then dwarves in that sequence is how much information that's available, and how, interestingly enough, how much of it parallels each other. So the writers and creators of this stuff back in the day were also looking at things like Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien's work, and they were drawing heavily upon those influences, not just his work, but other fantasy book authors of the day, and mythology as well. And so when you get all that mixed in together, we start getting some pretty harebrained, interesting, strange, and weird things. And to have people that make an effort to to run a continuance. So halflings and hobbits, regardless of what fantasy setting you set them in, with the exception of the Kinder's obsessive pickpocket, sticky finger syndrome, are pretty much uniform. And I think that's nice, because there's always this drive when you're creating something, when you're a writer or a designer, and you're trying to avoid plagiarism, outright plagiarism, when everything carries a common thread. All the fantasy game settings out there, all the science fiction game settings available, all of them have so much in common with each other. It would not be unheard of to point at entire sections of one version of this and one version of that by two different companies and go, well, it's the same thing. Well, you just stole this guy. No, they didn't. They did. They borrowed it. Sure, they borrowed it, and then they reworded it as much as they could. But and then common sense kicks in a little bit too. It's just my point on that. So we get the general history of the halfling race, gods of the halflings, various stories, including the wanderings of the little man, and the harefoots, the stouts, the tall fellows, and the Kinder. The Kinder is, oh my God, as a dungeon master, I cringe. I have cringed more times when I get a new player that comes in and says, "Oh, I want to play a Kinder." Well, we're not in that setting, so you can't do it. Well, sure, they came through a portal, or they fell out of the sky, or somebody transported them, or pissed off wizard, whatever. Sure. Mostly because they just want to be pickpockets. They want to be little penny thieves. They think they're going to get their jollies and their laugh, and they're going to annoy the F out of everybody else at the damn table. Now, once in a rare blue moon, I'll work a player who really understands what it is to play a Kinder and how to play it well, so they're not terrorizing their fellow. They're entertaining the people at the table and not either boring them to tears or making them mad. I mean, it's just what it is. But so you get a variety of various halflings from different game settings as well. The term halfling, and all right. And then they get stories about how their families work, and their home set up, how they're growing up, subsistence and more, crafts, labors and products, village life, trade, all the stuff that you might want to know if you're going to play the character. If you're going to play a halfling, for example, or a gnome, having some basic information on how they lived and how they grew up and all this stuff, even if it doesn't apply to your character directly, is helpful, because it means you're not going to play. How many people you know that want to choose to play a dwarf, and they just but then they treat them like a human being. I mean, they treat they don't take into account the special uniqueness of that race of people, and why not to take advantage of that? So, riddles, villages and shires, warfare, tactics. Now, that's something else that goes over and over and over again when it comes to halflings. It comes up in numerous sources over the years, where it points out that halflings, as a rule, never war on each other. There's never been a conflict of halfling on halfling genocide ever in any recorded history that I know of. And then there's the fact that they are, I don't want to call them pacifists, but they are conflict oriented, and as much as possible. So they will negotiate to the 11th second of the 11th minute of the 11th hour, and keep pushing, because there's that. If they can avoid that conflict, then so much the better. And if it takes longer to talk about it, but we can still avoid that conflict, that's a halfling way. But once they get that point, things trip over the wire, or they're put into a corner. Halflings fight tenaciously and viciously, and they are quite clever between using the terrain and traps and numerous skill sets such as mimicry and sneakery. I'm just saying that makes them pretty potent. So you won't see a massive halfling army stand up in the field and take you on head on, because, well, that would be suicide on the part of the halflings, or at least really detrimental to their side, because they would take a whole lot for unproportionately larger casualties. It just would. I mean, you imagine a bunch of halfling pikemen standing their ground in front of a charge of humans on chargers. I mean, Jesus, it'd roll down and roll over top of them like they were freaking pincushions. It'd be a bad day for the horse. Well, the horses wouldn't enjoy it either, but the halflings sure wouldn't. My point, though, is that they have tactics that they employ, and quite successfully. Usually, it's fade and hit and run, fade, hit and fade. Once again, using terrain and their knowledge of the area is much to their advantage. Giving ground. Ground is worthless to you if you can't hold it, and it's even more worthless to your enemy if they're stuck to it. That's just kind of goes hand in hand. But it's a nice little book, and there's a lot of good information. And once again, I believe we've all seen variants of this. Most of the material that's in here, especially the stuff on halflings themselves, has definitely been reprinted and updated for numerous other publications through Wizards of the Coast and other entities that controlled D&D at the time. So, I mean, yeah, I love it. Great. I haven't read it for a long time, so it was nice to pull it off the shelf and start going through it. And there you go. Till next time, you guys have yourself a great weekend.